ability to understand how it works, to understand how it works.
Live from Indianapolis, Indiana, this is the iPad Possibility Show with your host, Tim Chapman, and co-host, Ryan Anderson.
Welcome to the iPad Possibilities Podcast, episode number 26. Live with Ken Case of the OmniGroup, Part 2. Well, welcome, and this is the iPad Possibilities Podcast. This podcast is supported by the application It's On My Way in the App Store now for $2.99. Get it today to quickly plan out your routes. Welcome, and this is the iPad Possibilities Podcast. Today, we are going to continue the discussion that ran on Sunday night. We were talking, John and I, with Ken Case of the OmniGroup. And in this first part, the first part that aired on Monday and Tuesday, we focused generally on the OmniGroup. What do they bring? What possibilities does this software developing company bring to the iPhone, the iPad, and even the Mac? And today we're going to move away from generally speaking to more focused. We're going to focus in and talk about the 5 different productivity applications coming to the iPad. Currently, OmniGraph and OmniGraph Sketch are already released and on the iPad. And we're going to talk about the other 3 as well today with Ken Case of the OmniGroup. So without further ado, I bring you part 2 of the discussion we had with Ken Case. Enjoy.
I'd like to move on from just general talk about your applications to kind of focus in on the apps themselves. So you guys have 5 different productivity apps, and we've been talking about OmniGraffle, but we haven't really described exactly what it is. So what is OmniGraffle?
Sure. OmniGraffle is a symbolic drawing program, I guess you might say. It's a diagramming program. It's a wireframing program. It's something that you can make drawings in, using a mouse or now using your fingers. But the things that you're drawing are actually sort of objects that it remembers. So they're not, it's not like a sketchpad application like where you would just draw something on the canvas and then draw something else over it if you want to change it. All of these objects that you've drawn, you can now move around. You can change what their outlines look like, how they're filled. You can connect them to each other. You can have OmniGraffle automatically lay out a graph for you if you want. So as an example, you could do an org chart for your business, and you put the president and connect some managers maybe to them, and then the people who report to those managers, you connect them to their managers and so on. And then when you're done, you can actually tell OmniGraffle, "Oh, I'd like you to just automatically lay this out for me," and it will turn that into an organized graph on the screen. I don't use that so much for org charts, but I do use it for example, code classes, where we'll bring in a bunch of, we'll be looking at some code that we're not familiar with, maybe from the SDK, and it will, if you drag a project file on, an Xcode project on the Mac over to OmniGraffle, it will automatically open up all of the classes in there and make a graph out of them and show you sort of what the relationships are to each other, and lay it out in a nice way. So that's sort of what OmniGraffle does. So one of its more popular use cases, which I think I've just mentioned in passing a few times, is making wireframes, which is basically making prototype interfaces of websites or of, iPad applications or iPhone applications or Mac applications, whatever, where you sort of take a mock-up of what you want your screen to look like, and you just draw it in OmniGraffle, and you can start out having it look really sort of, a little bit more like a sketch, like something you would have just drawn on the back of a napkin. And that's really easy, especially on the iPad with its new sketching mode and being able to touch draw on the screen. And then as you want to refine it further and further, you can take that same graph and say, okay, now I'd like to make all of the squares perfectly square, but with rounded corners that are maybe 3 or 4 pixels inset, and I'd like to add nice background color or wash there, and so on. So you can polish it up and have it look exactly the way that you're wanting your web page or your application to look in the end, and then you can actually hand that to the developers and say, okay, here's what you're building, make it look like this, and that's how we design these apps ourselves.
Sure. Who do you actually see as the target audience for OmniGraph? Because I've been playing with it, and I could see a lot of different use cases. I've used it to, as a student, create storyboards for a video I'm working on, to, in class, actually take down what they're drawing on the board, and actually wrote a piece of music on it with, I'm a composer, so I've actually written an abstract music piece with OmniGraph. So what's the target audience? Who is it?
Yeah, no, that we tend to have that problem with a lot of our applications, where what we built was what we felt was a general purpose, productivity tool. So anybody who wants to design things visually, or who likes to think visually, I think OmniGraph is a great tool for them, because you can put this stuff around and move it around and shape it the way you want. And then you can send the results off as PDF or whatever. People doing network layouts, any sort of thing that needs a visualization to it, I guess, is ultimately a good candidate for this market. It's not again for people who are trying to draw pictures, to paint a picture. It's not Photoshop, but. And that's not its intent. But I have used it for doing. We just used it this morning to, lay out a bunch of pictures, drag some pictures onto the canvas, set the shapes to be a little bit more rounded on the edges, and so on, and then sent them to somebody to add to a book that they were printing of those pictures.
Sure, I actually used it to create a logo the other day as well for a business I'm working on. Just because it's so easy to just make a shape, whatever kind of shape you want, and put text inside of it. So, I mean, it was a simple logo, but it worked really well for that.
Right. Yeah. I guess I haven't even mentioned anything about being able. Yeah, you can attach text. It supports rich text for every, all kinds of fonts and whatever fonts are available on your machine, whatever typesetting is available, and that's one of the things that we're also improving in this next version of OmniGraph on the iPad. It can currently read rich text that was created on the Mac, and by rich text I mean text that has, for example, a bold word inside it. But on the pad itself, you can only say, I would like to make this entire shapes text bold. I can't make just a single word bold, or a single word a different color or a different size or whatever. So that's something that we are building for this next release on the iPad as well.
Sure. Oh,
Ken, does the application right now support video out? So, like, if you had a group that were trying to do some brainstorming, can the app project?
No, actually, it doesn't. That was one of the things that we were surprised to discover once we had access to the real hardware. I didn't realize that it would be a whole different API that you sort of just had to build. You have to build what's on that screen for the video out, and send it to that monitor separately from what you're drawing on your main screen. You can't just turn on mirroring or something along those lines.
Right.
So that's not in there yet. It's not even in there in 1.1. I did play around with it a little bit to try to figure out how is that going to work. And it is something that we do plan, because I think that is a common thing that people, they'll create these diagrams that they. It is used a lot in creative professions where, like website designers, for example, use it a lot. And I think where they would often want to bring the results to a meeting and then set it up in a projector in a business meeting.
Right.
And so we would love to be able to use video out for that, like we can on the desktop.
Well, are there any other features you're working on adding to the iPad app that didn't make it into the initial release?
Oh, all kinds. I mean, let's see. I've mentioned Graphltopia. I've mentioned video out. Yeah, there are a lot of features. Not, I guess I'm not prepared to talk about them all yet or announce them all yet. But this really is, the 1.0 release that we had time to finish in this time frame, and we expect to be, well, if you look at our iPhone 1.0 release that we got out of OmniFocus for iPhone, we shipped that about 2 years ago now, and we've been adding features to that on a regular basis ever since. It's up at version 1.6 now, and it has things like maps and time-based notifications and all kinds of other things that we didn't even think of at the start.
Sure.
That got added on later. So we expect to be adding features to this for a while yet.
Well, to close out the OmniGraffle discussion, I thought it'd be cool if you have any tips or tricks about using the OmniGraffle software on the iPad. I noticed I'm not sure if it's documented anymore, but if you do a 3-finger tap, that'll actually paste in what you have on your clipboard. Are there any more tips or tricks like that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think what. So as the next one comes out, the stuff that's on my mind right now is some of the features that we just did for the next release. So I guess as the next one comes out, look for being able to do things like put 2 fingers on a shape and rotate the shape directly on the canvas instead of right now. If you want to rotate a shape, you have to tap the shape and then go up to the info panel and then run the rotate dial over there. But you should be able to do that directly instead. If you haven't discovered it yet, there is built-in help inside there's an Omni menu in the document browser up in the top right-hand corner. There's like a little Omni button. And if you press that, it has options like Contact Omni and Online Help. So there's built-in help there that does talk about a lot of the things that you might not otherwise discover. But I'm not even sure if it listed 3-finger tap. There were a few other things like that we weren't sure how it would end up feeling on the device, and we weren't ready to commit to it being there forever. So until we had a chance to look at it and see how it worked.
Sure. Well, I just wanted to mention for everyone listening that the equivalent software, if you can call it that, on the Windows side is Microsoft's Visio, and I just looked up their pricing on it, and it's either $260 for the regular standard version or an enormous $560 for the Pro version. And it's only $50 on the iPad, and then I think your Mac apps are $100 and $200. So your Pro version is even less than the standard Microsoft version of what you guys do with OmniGraffle.
Yeah, no, we've always felt like our pricing was pretty reasonable. So I hope, and I think most of our customers feel the same way. I hope so.
Well, I'll just say that I've been an OmniGraffle and Outliner and Focus user for years, and I actually prefer to do stuff on the Mac, and then I have the Pro version of OmniGraffle, and then I move it over to Visio for work people that need to look at it. Much better environment on the Mac than on Visio.
So now that I've had a chance to think about you asked about features to look for in OmniGraffle on the iPad. One common question that people have come up with is, how do I move something forward or backward? It's not in the contextual menu that you get when you tap on something that you've already selected. But if you bring up the over sort of in the top left next to the button that takes you back to your documents list, there's a button that will list your canvases and your layers and so on. And in there's also a list of all of your objects grouped by which layer they're on. And if you tap edit there, you can move items around within their layers or between layers just by dragging them up and down that list. So that's how you can move something forward and backward. And I'm not saying that that's the interface we want in the long term, but if you're looking for that right now, that's the only way to get that. Another feature maybe that is a little bit more discoverable is that if you tap draw in the top right hand corner, and this is mentioned in the intro document, but I think it's worth reinforcing. If you tap the draw into draw mode in the top right hand corner, and then over there you can switch into freehand mode, and that's just a great way to quickly sketch out something without having to slow down to think about what object am I dragging out from the stencil list or whatever. So you can quickly sketch something up, and then later you can turn that into something more polished.
Yeah, that's one of the cool things. I always demo that when people see my iPad. It's like when I demo something out, I show them OmniGraffle and then the freehand, and then instantly can change it into this really cool shape. And when you go in the stencil mode, or I forget what it's called exactly.
Right, and then if you drag these shapes around, they have smart guidelines that will make it easy to align them with the other shapes that are already on the page. So they will notice when the shape center is matched with the center of another shape. A little guideline line will appear, and they'll kind of pause there a little bit for you. So that's one of the reasons I think that people who are doing website mockups, for example, find it so handy, is because they can quickly sketch the stuff out, move it into place, and they don't have to use a tool to align it, because they can just directly manipulate it into the right place and have those smart guides help them. Yeah.
Well, moving on the next app, OmniGraph Sketcher. What is OmniGraph Sketcher? It kind of says in the name that you sketch graphs out. But
absolutely. Yeah, it's our tool for sketching graphs, which is kind of unique. We're kind of surprised that it's such a unique space that people hadn't really done before. So, in it, what do I mean by sketching graphs? I mean that it should be as easy to draw a graph on your iPad with OmniGraph Sketcher as it is to draw a graph on a piece of paper. Right. So if you have like an economics graph where you're wanting to show the relationship between supply and demand, and you're going to draw, this curve going up and this other curve going down, that if you want to do that on a computer without OmniGraph Sketcher, typically you have a couple choices. You could either go to like a spreadsheet maybe and plug in some numbers for those two lines that you want to draw. Or if you want, you could, but you have to make up the numbers, and you kind of have to get it to do the scale and so on. That's going to take a little while. Or you could maybe just go to a tool like Illustrator and try to draw them in that tool. But neither one of those are really satisfactory ways to build a graph. It's going to take you a lot longer than it would take you to just quickly sketch it on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard or chalkboard or something if you're trying to illustrate it to other people. But with OmniGraph Sketcher, the notion is you have a draw tool where you simply tap on the points that you want, from one point to another, and it'll draw lines, a line between each of the points that you've drawn. Or you can drag using that draw tool to create a freehand line, a curve that you've drawn. So that's how you might do that curve going up. And it will automatically smooth out the curve for you when it's done. You can drag the points around on the curve later. So if it's not exactly where you want it, you can move it after the fact. And then you can also automatically do fills. So there's a separate fill tool that you just drag along any sort of line that is already on the graph, and you pause at the corners, where you want to turn from one line to another, and it will automatically fill in that region with whatever color your fill is set to. After the fact, you can change, the parameters around your fill, what color it is, and so on. So that's the basic notion of OmniGraph Sketcher. It's really easy to use. It's inexpensive. It's only $15 on the iPad, and it's a fun little tool for anybody who ever needs to draw a graph.
Sure.
So it's more focused on conceptualizing a graph as opposed to documenting the real data that might be, production data with a graph. Yeah,
I mean, you can put in, especially in the version 1.1 release that we just released this last week, the update, you can now copy and paste in data points that you brought in from a spreadsheet or whatever. But that's not really, I think, where its unique benefits come into play, right? That this notion of just being able to draw something as easily as you could have drawn it on paper. There are a lot of ideas that I think people can communicate with graphs and want to communicate with graphs, but if they if they've tried to do it before on a computer, it was way too cumbersome to get that point across. Trying to, it's hard to think of, all right, what are all the numbers along that line that I want to do if you're trying to do it in a spreadsheet. If you were trying to do it in Illustrator, well, you don't have numbers anymore, so you can't say, oh, well, this should be twice that number, and so on. So it is where you're working with quantitative data and concepts, but our primary use case is for this sort of conceptual communication through graphs, rather than like it's not a plotting package.
Right.
It doesn't a lot of sorts of things that people might wish they could do out of a plotting package. There are great tools for doing statistical analysis using there's a free tool called R that's great for stuff like that on the Mac, and we were really looking to solve a problem that hadn't been solved well before.
Sure. Do you see it as more for a student tool, or a business professional tool, or what's the target for this one? I mean,
yeah, some of those are, I think, I think you've named the two audiences that that this really seems to appeal to the most. That students, and I guess I really should say education, right? Because teachers, of course, also want to do this sort of stuff on, in the graphs that they're creating on, that they might otherwise draw on a chalkboard. And they might still draw on a chalkboard, but if you wanted to project this or something, or email this out to your students, this is a great way to do it and really have a polished-looking result at the end, which is not something that you typically get with hand-drawn content.
Sure.
And the same thing, of course, then goes for business. That if you're trying to communicate this idea and you want it to really look professional, but it is just an idea at this point. It's not a set of real numbers. It's maybe here's what we think would happen if we made this change, and now you can see how it would affect these two other factors or whatever, and something's going down, something else is going up. Just to give them a concept of what you're talking about, a visual concept. That's I think a great tool in both of those settings.
Well, I had another question about the OmniGraph Sketcher program. It's different from the Mac app because you're touching the screen now. What does it do better now that you have this touch screen instead of the mouse and keyboard interface?
I think it does all of that better. It does, the way I think the process of adding a fill, for example, to the graph, I think is much more natural on this touch screen, where now you just draw an outline across the area that you want to fill than what we used to do on the Mac side. Some of these are improvements that we could probably bring back to the Mac as well. That particular case is, but even then, it's hard to be to draw something that you want with a mouse and have it come out looking quite the way you want. Whereas it's a little bit easier to just put your finger on the page and quickly drag it across.
Sure.
Or certainly faster. So maybe I should turn that around. What doesn't it do better? I guess it doesn't handle really large data sets as well because it's not as fast a device.
Right.
So if you have a graph that is trying to display, thousands of points, that's not going to work nearly as well on the iPad as it does on the Mac.
Okay. Are there any enhancements you're wanting to add to it, or is it pretty much complete since it's a more, simple program than OmniGraffle?
Yeah, no, it is a lot more directed, and it has met its initial goals. There are some things, some popular requests that we have from customers, and things that I wish it had itself, like log graphs, for example. Being able to add log scale graphs, it would be nice to put in the application, but I think and regression lines, I think, on the iPad app, we have those on the Mac app, but not on the iPad. So there certainly are some things, but I think the basic promise of what this app is supposed to be is already in place and working quite well.
Is there a way to easily create like the classic bell graph or any of those things?
So not from pre-existing data. Of course, you could just draw kind of a bell graph on the screen, and then you can sit there and adjust the points to make it more perfect, quickly. If I create a new document here right now on my iPad, let me see how that turns out. So yeah, I can quickly create, and it's my hump is a little bit leaning to the right at the moment, so I'll stop and I'll tap this and I'll drag it over to the left, and so you can sort of fix it up that way. But it's if you're doing it there isn't a tool that just says now I'd like to add in a bell graph data set. If you have a bell graph data set, of course you could paste that in. So it just accepts copy and pasted data from numbers, for example.
Right.
And so if you have a table of information and you want to plug that in, then yeah, paste is the easiest way to do that.
Okay.
Well, John, do you have any other questions about?
I would just a comment. I really think that I played around with OmniGraph Sketcher on the Mac. Didn't really have a lot of use for it, but I see it really is going to come into its own on the iPad. It's a perfect tool for the iPad. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, moving on to one of my favorite apps, because I rely on it daily on my iPhone and Mac, is OmniFocus. So you said it's a to-do app. What exactly, is that all it is, or what exactly is OmniFocus?
What is OmniFocus? So it's kind of like a to-do app on steroids, I guess you could say. It's a to-do app for people who have way too much to do. So if you only have 10 things to do at the moment, and that's all you need to track, OmniFocus is probably not worth it for you. I don't think that's not what it's designed to solve. It can solve that problem. You can just toss your 10 items into the inbox and then just check them off directly out of the inbox, and you don't have to use all of the rest of the features and complexity in there. But there are probably other apps that can do that simple case just as well, and it's not. Maybe they wouldn't sync over the cloud as well. So maybe that part's worth it still. But where it really starts to shine is when you start to have a lot of projects going on which have multiple steps involved, and maybe some of those steps even have multiple steps. So it's a completely hierarchical to-do list. Its heritage is that it came out of our outlining tool. So as you can imagine, with an outliner, a lot of people were using that to come up with plans of things that they wanted to get done, and they would have maybe a heading section like, okay, I want to bring all of our apps to the iPad, and like, okay, well, one of the things, sub projects in there that I want to do is bring OmniFocus to the iPad, and okay, as pieces of that, I need to design a new interface, and so on and so forth, right? And then I'm going to talk to Bill about the new design for the interface, and you start to have several levels of hierarchy going on as you think about your work and break it up into a project plan. And that's really sort of the heritage then that OmniFocus is about. It's about tracking this complicated list of all of the stuff that you want to get done. There's another direction to this, another dimension, if you will, to your task, which is, I've sort of talked about here is the structure of my tasks and their goals and how they relate to, this goal of porting all of our apps to the iPad, but there's also this other dimension of, okay, what is it going to take to be able to get this stuff done? And in OmniFocus, we call that your context. So context can be a location or a person or a tool, whatever you think is sort of the most important element that will help you accomplish this task. So maybe as I'm thinking about porting OmniFocus over to the iPad, the first thing that I need to get done is to talk with Bill, our UI team lead, about coming up with these mockups and sketching that. So for that example, then my context is going to be Bill. I'm going to talk with Bill about this task. So why is it useful then to, assign? I'm sort of almost. It could seem like I'm actually making this even more complicated now. I'm not only have this tree of tasks that are related to what goal I'm trying to get done, but now I've got this extra metadata about Bill that is associated. Well, where that becomes really useful is then when I go to meet with Bill about this, I can pull up my Bill context and it says, oh, okay, I wanted to talk with Bill about the UI design for OmniFocus on the iPad. And I also wanted to talk with Bill about OmniGraffle 2 on the iPad, or OmniGraph. I wanted to talk with him about his vacation plans next month. Something completely unrelated. And so having your tasks organized in both of these dimensions, where you have both the sort of project-oriented goals that you're doing that the tasks lead to, as well as the context-oriented actions. Where am I going to get this stuff done? Really can make people more efficient when they have a lot of things that they're trying to manage. Another example might be that I'm headed to the grocery store and I see that not only did I want to get some milk today, but I also wanted to get a light bulb and I wanted to pick up something else for the office, or a pencil or something. And I can get all of those at the grocery store. I don't have to forget that because I was only looking at my grocery list that I had these other things to do that were on some of these other projects that could also be done at the same place. So that's kind of the basic premise of OmniFocus, that you plan your stuff in projects and you act on them in context. And it's been very, very popular on the Mac and on the iPhone. The opening weekend that we released it on the iPhone, we had over 10,000 people just buy it that weekend. So it's got very loyal customer base, and we're really looking forward to bringing that to the iPad, where we can have a lot more rich interactions than are currently possible on the iPhone. While at the same time, I think having a cleaner, more focused experience than you might see on your Mac, where you tend to have a lot of other distractions and windows and stuff going on. That when you're trying to get things done, sometimes it helps to just have a screen that's focused on just the stuff that you're trying to get done.
Right. I can imagine just having an iPad sitting next to you with OmniFocus just opened all the time, just telling you what you need to be working on while you're on your Mac.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, I will just comment that I actually use the kinkless GTD templates in Omni Outliner. That was the root of where OmniFocus came from, and you guys have done an excellent job of making that tool really work well.
Thank you. Yeah, our first goal for OmniFocus was simply to make it at least do everything that kinkless was doing and do it at least as well. But with better integration, a better sense of Outliner wasn't really designed to manage to-do list tasks. So, for example, when you checked something off, it wouldn't be hidden, and so all the stuff that you checked off was still in your list. And kinkless kind of tried to work around that with kinkless, for those who don't know, is a set of Apple scripts for Omni Outliner. And so you had a button that you could hit on the toolbar in Omni Outliner that then would collect your tasks and kind of move them somewhere else where they would be hidden and out of your way, archive them for you. But it's much nicer to have a tool that actually understands what makes a task and understands due dates and is able to give you alerts and so on and so forth.
Sure. You talked a little bit about interface coming to the iPad. Have you guys thought much about it yet, or is that still kind of really beta E and alpha?
Oh, we've thought a lot about it, but it's as always with UI design, we make a lot of changes as we work through it. So if you look at the screenshots from 2 weeks ago, they you can see the history and the resemblance to what's there today, but it doesn't necessarily look like certainly doesn't look exactly like it, and is maybe going to look wildly different depending on which elements you're looking at. So it's still in progress. It's still we're still updating that design, and as we implement pieces and we discover what actually feels like it's working well on the iPad, or it doesn't feel like it's working well, we're continuing to iterate those designs as well. And that's one of the nice things, of course, about developing now with iPads in our hands that was sort of awkward to try to do when it was just in the simulator.
Right. Is it any easier now because you have the iPhone client, or is it a different code base entirely?
It is easier. The code that is shared with the iPhone is mostly the same code that is shared with the Mac. So, when we brought OmniFocus from the Mac over to the iPhone, we had to throw away all of the interface layers. We had to throw away some of the underneath layers that talked to, like how we talked to the database that we were using. We had to completely re-implement that. So we ended up writing a whole lot of stuff to make it portable between these platforms. And now that we have done that, of course, we can take all of that portable code and reuse that that engine code on the iPad, and that gives us a head start. But there is a lot of new stuff that we still have to write because we are designing now for a very different device in terms of what how you would interact with it and what information is available on the screen when and so on.
Well, I had another question. I was wondering, you've mentioned how the iPhone client, you have different features than the Mac client, such as have geolocation information so you can be alerted when you're close to something to do a task. Is there anything that's going to be unique to the iPad that doesn't exist on the iPhone or the Mac clients yet?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Before the announcements.
Yeah. I think that's about all I'm prepared to say at the moment.
Okay. Yeah. I know I'm trying to talk about unannounced software as of yet, so that's exciting that there's new stuff coming that we don't have yet.
And one way to think about it is we wrote OmniFocus for the Mac. What has it been? Almost, well, when we posted the screenshots, it was almost 4 years ago now, the first round of, or maybe that was 3 years ago when we, well, let's see, the iPhone app has been out for 2 years, and the Mac app had been out for about a year before that.
Yeah, I remember its release.
We'd done some screenshots and so on, we'd been working on it for a year before that. So the basic design of the Mac app, which, as I sort of mentioned, was largely just based on the design of Kinkless GTD from Outliner. That design is a bit long in the tooth since then, and we've learned a lot since then about what people might want to do with this and how they might interact with it more efficiently. And we learned a lot when we brought the app over to the iPhone about how we could try to simplify the interface and so on. So basically, I think this will be our first version 2 interface. We're not going to call it OmniFocus 2 for iPad, but it's and it's not going to have all the features maybe that we will have later as we get OmniFocus 2 for real done. So some of the things that people might be expecting from watching our forums about OmniFocus 2, that's not what I'm talking about. But it is a chance to really redesign that interface.
Ken, do you see any issues with OmniFocus or really any of the other iPad apps kind of potentially stealing customers away from your Mac apps?
Yeah, absolutely. That was another concern, I guess, going back to your pricing question, is if we make these too inexpensive on the iPad, will we still have any customers left on is it going to steal away all of our customers and they'll just be paying us, a few dollars on the iPad and we won't have enough money to continue to feed our employees. There's in the best situation, of course, it's nice to have it on these tools on more than one of your devices, so that they synchronize together. And so hopefully, there is some, having the iPhone app, I think, actually increased our Mac app sales of OmniFocus. It didn't steal away from it. But the iPad is kind of a middle ground where it actually does have a lot of the functionality that the Mac app had. It is a concern. We're not going to cripple the iPad app as a result of that. We still want it to, want to make the best software that we can there. And so we'll just have to kind of see what develops, I guess.
Sure.
So will this be definitely a different app than the iPhone version? I mean, you're not looking at a universal. You're looking at a distinctly different app.
Yes, it's definitely a distinctly different app. You have to. Well, as I said, we're completely redesigning it. If we could just do the iPhone app on there and scale it up and have it turn out to be a good result, we would have already done that. We would have shipped that. We'd have our iPad app out right now. But that just did not yield a satisfactory result. So we're glad that we.
Let's move on.
Okay. Well, I'm the Outliner. I have not used this in the Mac that much just because I use Evernote for a lot of the things. I'm not a big Outliner. But what is OmniOutliner? Why would someone use it?
So I mentioned before that OmniGraffle is a tool for people who sort of think visually and are trying to communicate or present information visually. there's another set of people like myself who tend to think in terms of just hierarchy and relationships, but more sort of textually. And so before Omni Outliner existed, I tend to take my notes in outlines, and I tend to write my papers in outlines and so on. And this is for people who think in outlines. They think about, all right, here are some of the big items, and now I want to break it down into smaller things that maybe are related to those big items or support those big items, and maybe break it down further and further and so on. And it's again, it's kind of hard to pin down a specific small audience that this is for. It's not, it's a general purpose tool for people who think in these sorts of textual concepts more than visually. So let's see. I used it for project planning a lot before we wrote OmniPlan. I use it to write most of my blog posts or anything else, any long mail messages, or think of any speeches I'm going to give or whatever. I tend to write these things down in Omni Outliner before taking it somewhere else. It tends to be where a lot of our projects actually start at Omni, where you brainstorm a bunch of ideas, you sort of collect them into groups, and all right, what are the parts that we're going to keep and eliminate, and what's in version 1, what's in version 1.1, what's in version 2, and so on. It's kind of a place where a lot of projects start.
Actually, I've been a long time Omni Outliner user, and it's really a unique tool, and I'm definitely looking forward to being on the iPad, because there are so many people I know who use a spreadsheet for what Omni Outliner does so well, and that's really to manipulate text in a column row kind of format without being a number based thing, but really text.
Right. Yeah. It's a tool for manipulating text relationships. So I guess I talked a little bit about what it's used for and didn't talk about how it works. So maybe if listeners aren't familiar with it, they won't get a sense of what it does. So you enter your outline. You can say add a child to this element, or add another sibling. You just hit return to add another row to the outline. You can drag things in and out to indent them or outdent them. And when you have a group of elements, then you can collapse them just by clicking on a little triangle, like you can do in Finder's list mode, to hide a whole section of the document and re-expand it. Outliners. They have a long history. They didn't start with Omni Outliner. Certainly, there's an outliner called More that was on the Mac long before we were, and that a lot of people loved, but was unfortunately abandoned, I think, in the 90s. And typically the tools, around the late 80s and 90s, at that time, More, I think, cost about $200. I don't remember exactly. It's whereas we've tried to really make Outliner much more affordable. It's only $40 on the Mac.
Yeah, and let me just go into a little bit more, because our listeners really should check it out, because not only can you do all the normal outlining things, but being able to create new columns with, maybe like I've used it in programming, where you might put your classes in one column and then attributes and different things associated with them in other columns, and you can move all that stuff around and it all stays with it. It's really a great thing to be able to have multiple pieces of text that are related, and keep them related.
One of the things that I just used it for last week was doing my taxes, and I was writing down, all right, here are sort of the major. It didn't calculate my taxes for me, right? That's not what I mean, but it helped me collect the information that I knew I was going to need in preparing my taxes, so I could write down, all right, here are all of the bank statements that I have interest reports from, and here's my W-2, and so on the income side, and therefore here's the total income, and now here are my expenses that are deductible, and so here some of the donations that I made or whatever, and I could write these things down, have a number column so the outline column showed sort of what the thing was that was on the list, and then there was a number column to the right that showed the amount for it, and I told Outliner to automatically summarize that column. So as I entered numbers, it would automatically calculate what the totals were for each of those pieces. And I could have, I could group my charity donations in under expenses and have them all then sort of grouped together and listed as, oh, okay, here are all of your nonprofit donations. And that sort of thing you could also do in Excel, certainly. But it's really hard to add an item, or it's not nearly as easy to add an item in the middle of a summarized set of values in Excel. So if you wanted to insert a row in the middle, you might have to update your formulas to make sure that it wasn't now skipping that new row that you had added. Or if you wanted to add one on the end, especially, then it might not automatically extend to cover that. And because outlines are organized in this in this outline form that tells you what the relationships are between parents and their children, you can see that, I just add up the children to calculate the value of the parent, and I add up the parent and its peers to calculate the value of its parent, and so on.
Yep.
Sure.
And Outliner also supports adding, unless you think it's just about text, you can also add in any sort of pictures, movies, audio files. It has in the Pro version, you can record directly in the application. So some students like to use that during lectures to record what their professor's saying as they're taking notes, and so on.
Okay. What kind of major design changes do you see going forth with the iPad version versus the Mac version?
Well, we'll have to be careful once again about memory limitations now that we sort of, know the difference between this mobile device and, that has to really think about battery constraints and so on, and what we're used to on the desktop. But I think less about, limitations and more about possibilities. I think there's a lot of potential in this with this interface where you are sort of directly touching your outline and having this very focused experience. I don't know if either of you have ever used Lightroom for text editing, but doing that sort of editing, using an app on the iPad is a lot like that, where you're really just focused on the task at hand, and everything else has to disappear.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you. I have used Lightroom, and I think that that's kind of a thing that the iPad seems to be bringing to people is that ability to focus as opposed to multitask. Even when it will multitask in the future, it's still focusing on the task at hand and not having the distractions. And I think that's can be really useful.
Yeah, and I think it's something we didn't really think about very much as we started using computers in the first place. What is the mental cost of letting people multitask? And sometimes you really do need a lot of windows to accomplish what you're doing. I have a lot of windows up right now, but sometimes it is nice to just focus in on one thing and you try to get into flow on the work that you're doing, and not have those side distractions going on.
Sure. Do you have any other questions, John, before we move on the Omni plan?
No.
Okay. Well, if you haven't heard at the beginning of the show, Omni Outliner is coming to the iPad. Sometime this summer is the rumor, as you guys announced earlier.
That is rumor. Well, it's announced, so I guess it's not a rumor, but it's also tentative. Plans change as we get closer to that. That's just basically that's my best guess at the moment. And if it changes, I will try to let people know as soon as we figure that out.
Yeah, that's what I meant by rumor, tentative.
Right.
Not quite synonyms.
Yeah.
Well, the final app, OmniPlan, it's kind of a sibling of OmniFocus, just with groups. Can you kind of explain for those that have never used it on the Mac?
Sure. So OmniPlan is our project planning application. So it's really designed for cases where you are not just managing your own tasks, but you're thinking about all of the tasks involved in a project and all of the people working on that project, and how that stuff is going to fit together and then you're trying to plan how to make it fit together best. How are you going to use your team most effectively? How are you going to use any other resources you have available most effectively? And so the closest app, for people who are in that space, they probably are most familiar with something like Microsoft Project on Windows, where you're building a Gantt chart, and OmniGraph is also, OmniPlan is also a tool where you're building a Gantt chart and putting this stuff together. But it is, I think, the easiest tool to build a Gantt chart that hopefully anyone has ever encountered. Certainly the easiest that I've ever encountered, where when you start a plan in OmniPlan, all you really have to do to start making this plan is enter a list or an outline of the tasks that you want to get done and estimate how long each of those tasks will take. And it will build a Gantt chart for you that you can quickly level and spread out across the page. And when you want to get more involved, then you can start adding dependencies between the tasks. Well, I can't start programming that interface until the UI team has finished designing that interface, and documentation can't write, take screenshots for the help until we've actually got the screenshots ready, so until we've actually coded up that part of it, and so on, right? You can build in those sorts of dependencies and teams and everything else, but you don't have to start there. You can start with a very simple outline, and like all of our apps, it's then designed to grow with you, and as you need more complexity, then you can add extra columns that control things like the start date constraints and the due date constraints, and I won't have this machine available until next Friday. That's when I'll actually get my hands on a real iPad, but then and I only get it for a week before I have to give it up, so I better get all of my tasks for testing on the iPad done in that time frame or whatever.
Yeah, I would have to echo that it is probably one of the easiest to get into project planning tools. I'm actually a project manager professionally, and it's a great tool, and it's a joy to use as opposed to the groans I hear every time people talk about Microsoft Project. So,
oh, great! I'm glad to hear that.
Well, what kind of new use cases do you see for it now that it's in a mobile device such as the iPad?
Well, I think I wouldn't necessarily call them new use cases in the sense that I think a lot of people who were doing these sorts of project plans, the project planners who were bringing this stuff, they might bring it to a meeting with them and update it there on their laptop in the past. So it's not necessarily new for that. But I think if you bring an iPad to a meeting rather than a laptop to a meeting, I think it sort of fosters a sense of collaboration that is not there in the same way with with a laptop, where your screen is sort of a barrier between you and the people that you're meeting with. Now, with an iPad, you set it down in front of you, and everybody can see your screen. They can even reach out and touch your screen if you're working in that way. And I think it's just a more it's a nicer device to bring to a meeting than a laptop is. They don't think that you're off looking at Twitter or something when you're working on it.
Well, this version of OmniPlan will be modeled after OmniPlan 2, which is coming out pretty soon, I imagine. Are there any different features outside of the Mac OmniPlan 2 that'll make it sway to the iPad, you think?
I think it's premature.
Okay. Yeah, it's not coming out till fall, so these are kind of way out there in the future here.
Yeah, I think as we get it there, we'll start to see what makes the most sense and what things we may or may not do differently. And of course, OmniPlan 2 itself is now being designed a little bit in the context of iPad already existing, as opposed to our other apps that we designed before the iPad, before having any exposure to the iPad. So,
do you see a possibility of you've got OmniPlan running on your iPad, and do you see a possibility of, since so many people have iPhones, having a way for that data to, say you have John in the listing of people that's in the project, have a way for that to sync over to his iPhone to know what he needs to be working on?
Yeah, so I guess one thing that I've maybe hinted at in a few places in the past, and I'm okay with hitting at it in here. But one of the things that is our big goals for OmniPlan 2 is for it to synchronize its data with OmniFocus. So the notion is then that somebody who is planning a project can publish their plan to somewhere on the cloud, and other people who are on the team and they're using OmniFocus can subscribe to that plan from the cloud and say, oh, okay, yeah, here's all of the tasks now that are assigned to them from that project will show up in their OmniFocus database, in their task list. And as their assignments change, of course, new stuff appears in that list. As they finish items on that list, they can check them off. Their status updates get sent back up to the cloud, and OmniPlan then can collect that information and automatically update the plan. And that's a huge thing for project managers, where one of the biggest burdens on them is just trying to collect the information, the latest status from everybody who's involved in a project, and get what is the current completion level of the project. What tasks are done, what are not done, how far are they through them, what's sort of left to do. And anything we can do to help automate that, I think, will be received pretty well.
Sure.
Here.
Well, do you have any questions, John, about OmniPlan before we move on?
No, I don't think I do. I think many of us project management professionals will be looking for it to come out and be able to use the iPad for that purpose.
Sure. Well, that's planned tentatively to be released this fall. And I did have another question. On the Mac, you've got Pro and standard versions of your apps. Are you trying to get the feature set up to try to parody the Pro version or the standard version, or is it a whole different ball game here?
It's kind of a different ballgame, and I'm not sure if it makes sense yet, at least, to do completely different Pro and standard applications on the iPad space. Most people, if I look at, for example, OmniGroup sales, we sell about twice as many copies of Pro as we do standard. So most people on the Mac elect to go for the Pro version. But at the same time, we like having a standard version that is more affordable, that lets people, become introduced to the software and start using it in more basic capacities before, and once they then become educated about the software and start to grow further and decide that they are interested in the Pro stuff, that they can upgrade to the Pro version. And we offer them. Basically, we offer Pro at the difference in price. If they want to upgrade from standard to Pro, they just pay the difference in price. They don't have to rebuy a whole different product or pay more than they would have if they had bought Pro straight in the first place. So that model is working out pretty well for us on the Mac. But on the iPad, in the App Store in general, there's no way to offer upgrade pricing. And we could maybe look at doing in-app purchases for some of those features, and we may explore that yet. I'm not sure yet how that will turn out, but I think that's probably more likely, since that's our only upgrade path for customers that preserves their existing investment, than doing completely separate standard and Pro apps.
Right. The one downside I think it's present is you can only do upgrade pricing in-app purchases on one iPad. So if you own 5 iPads, you have to do 5 upgrades on each of those iPads.
Oh, really? I did not know that. I haven't explored it yet.
I'm pretty sure. I may be wrong in this, but I thought that's the case.
I guess I would hope that it would be tied to your iTunes account, but yeah, I guess I don't know. So maybe it depends on what type of thing you're purchasing.
Yeah, I haven't explored it fully.
Yeah, that might be a big downside to taking that approach. And we have we've been talking with Apple about this problem for a while, and we don't have. They're certainly aware of it, and they're certainly thinking about it too. They just have a lot on their plates.
Yeah,
they've obviously had a lot to get done, and we're very happy with what they have done so far. But I'm hopeful that at some point in the future we'll start to see some ability to give discounted pricing to existing customers. Like if somewhere down the line we do introduce an OmniGroup 2, it would be nice if people could buy it with upgrade pricing rather than purchase it all over again for the original list price.
Right. Well, where do you see the future of the OmniGroup going? Is there going to be a sixth app that you are dying to write another one that's missing, a solution that's not out there? Where's the OmniGroup going, basically?
Sure. Well, we have a lot of app ideas that we're interested in writing, and so there is that direction to think about. But at the same time, we have a lot of apps now, and we don't want to abandon any of our current apps, or more importantly, abandon the customers who are using those apps.
Right.
So make them feel like they're abandoned. So. So we've already been feeling like we were stretched a little bit thin before even the iPad was introduced. Omni Outliner, for example, on the Mac, we have been doing regular updates, but it is starting to feel a little bit long in the tooth. The basic interface that is in Outliner 3 now is the same interface that we introduced 6 years ago. And in that time, mind you, again, we have done things like, how long ago was 6 years ago? That was before we had Intel hardware, Intel manufacturers. So, so 3.0 was released for PowerPCs only, and then 3.1 added Intel support. A lot of companies actually at that time charged for a whole new major release of their software, but we just offered that as a free update. And then, we've added support for Spotlight and for Quick Look, and all kinds of other new features in that time. But we haven't had time to really go back and revisit the Outliner interface in all of that time. We've been busy, again, doing lots of updates on 3.9.1 or 2, I think now. So it's not like it's just stayed still, but we really did want to revisit some of those decisions with new lessons we've learned, and with new lessons that the platform has taken, and how interfaces are designed. So we're, I guess that's to say, before we look at doing any new apps, I think we want to make sure that all of our current apps, have the attention that they need. And once we feel like they're all on, they've all had recent updates, and we still have time in our schedule, then we might take a look at doing some of the new ideas that we also have.
Sure. Well, do you have any final thoughts before we end the show?
Well, I guess I'd just like to wrap back around to the beginning and the conversation and say that the iPad is really exciting to us as a platform, as a multi-touch platform in particular. That we think this touch interface is the future direction of computing, and we see the iPad not just as the device that is there right now today, but as basically the first device that has a large enough screen for us to design the interfaces that we wanted to do on a touchscreen device. But we think that over time, the work that we're investing right now in the iPad is also going to apply to the future of our desktop platforms, that we're going to have multi-touch desktop platforms, and the version of OmniGraffle that we run on those is going to be based on the work that we're doing right now on the iPad. We really see that as the future direction of computing.
Sounds good. Well, if you want some more information about the OmniGroup, their website is omnigroup.com, and Ken's the CEO, and I think you were a co-founder of the company itself?
Yes.
Yeah. And then if you want to get more stencils for the OmniGraffle, you can go to graffletopia.com. They've got a wide variety of stencils there. And I'd like to thank you once again for being on the show. It's been great talking to you, because I really do see the OmniGroup as bringing the iPad to a productive level where you can actually get some real work done on it. So it's a thrill to talk to you, and thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for inviting me.
My thanks too, Ken. It's been great to talk to you, and hope that the OmniGroup is around for a long time, because you guys make great software.
Well, that concludes the discussion John and I had with Ken Case of the OmniGroup. I always appreciate feedback. Please send that to iPadPossibilities@gmail.com and 209-542-iPad. and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you been playing with the Omni apps? What do you think about them? I personally love them, but I'd love to hear your feedback. What would you like to see improved about the apps and all of those kinds of feedback? I'd love to hear back about that. Voicemail or email. I'd love to play some of those on the show to provide that feedback for everyone else as well. So I will be back to normal format with studio shows pretty soon here. I've got another interview lined up for next week, and I'm looking at doing a couple more. So let me know what you think about these interviews. I know it's a little bit different from the normal format of the iPad Possibilities podcast, but that is why we have multiple days where we can do shows, and the weekly thought is going to be always just me. So let me know what you think about those. Let me know what you think about the interviews. I'm having a lot of fun doing them, and it's been a blast talking to the developers now that the iPad is out and software is released, and it brings a whole slew of new possibilities that we couldn't have even talked about because apps were not out yet. So if you'd like to support the show, you can do that in one of many ways. First off, simply subscribe, review the show on iTunes, and rate the show on iTunes. If you do that, if you take 60 seconds out of your life and do that, that'd be of great help bringing this show up in visibility in iTunes and would let other people experience the show as you have. To monetarily support the show, you can do that by purchasing the iPad Possibilities podcast app found in the App Store for $2.99. And with that app, you get the shows Monday, Wednesday, and Friday instead of Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And coming out this week or the next week, I have now a webcam that is really fantastic at shooting video on the iPad. So I'll be doing some video shows demonstrating some apps that were not possible before without that. And those will be released only on the podcast app for now. I'm looking into doing a premium version of the show online as well, which would be paid, and you'd have access to the videos there, but starting out just on the podcast app. So get today in iTunes for $2.99. If you would like to find out more information about this show and other shows, you can go to thepossibilitiesnetwork.com. It's an entire network devoted to shows on possibilities and potential. So you can check out this show and many others there. And you can follow me on Twitter by just following tchatton. And I tweet a lot about iPad news and all of those sort of things. So if you want the latest, greatest, you can follow me there on Twitter. Until next time, this is Tim Chatton of the iPad Possibilities Podcast.